Dave, the strength of the consumer may be part of this story, but we see continued resilience in this part of the market in addition to tech. How do most people play this?
Well, I think, the big one here is XLY. That's the Spider Consumer Discretionary Fund. That it's $13 billion, trades like water. It's quite cheap. I think that's the way most people play this. And this is really dominated by some core retailers, particularly things like Home Depot. Amazon is a big, I think 15% of this fund. That's sort of the default button on this. But you also pick up a lot of, I think, pretty sensitive trade war sectors like automotives, which, makes this not my favorite play in the space.
Okay, so tell me then, and by the way, XLY, because of the market cap weight, you've got a huge amount of Amazon in here. So yeah. I guess the argument would be, look, if you're looking for something distinctly different, then what, just kind of the big cap weighting? Where else do you go?
Well, I think this really comes down to what we mean when we talk about consumer stocks, right? These definitions of what a staple or a service is, or discretionary or non-discretionary, those are just sort of made up concepts based on, I think, really how people thought about things like food back in the 1970s. I look at something like IYC, which is the iShares Services Sector Fund. I think this actually does a better job of capturing where I think most of us would think the real growth in the economy is coming when we see those strong consumer sentiment numbers. So you still get your Amazon exposure, you still get those things, but instead of putting cars in there, you're putting in some media companies like Netflix and Disney. And if you think about sort of the millennial consumer, I would argue that some of those core media properties are almost the staples of the modern economy. I think most people would rather go without a trip to Starbucks than they would rather turn off their Netflix account. So I like the idea of combining both these big retailers, some of the fast food companies like McDonald's, which obviously had great earnings recently, and then bolting in some of these core media names. That to me seems like the new consumer economy. A little bit more expensive, doesn't trade quite as well, but it's still a really strong fund.
I like your point here in the sector, and when discussing the sector, how do you define it? It's such an amorphous thing. Sometimes people say, oh, the consumer. Well, which consumer, which demographic, what part of it? And then, well, what about, retail, which we associate? I know we've talked about this before, and then that opens up a whole other can of worms because something like the XRT looks totally different than these funds.
Right, or if you go to the more traditional non-discretionary fund, what you load up on is frankly big old brand names, Pepsi, Coke, Procter & Gamble, and some big box stores like Costco. Those seem much less attractive to me. I'd much rather own something like Amazon than Costco right now. I think Amazon is the big box store of the next 20 years. And yeah, there's still some value to being able to go buy a giant pallet of, toilet paper or bottled water. But I think when we talk about that consumer confidence number, which is what this play is about for the rest of the year, I think you really have to lean into where consumers really spend their money.
Dave, what's interesting recently is this push into certain staples. I don't want to say the whole staples group or consumer non-discretionary, because some of them are getting really slammed because they don't have the ability to, pass on price or brand. But that's kind of the point, I think. Also, I want to get your thoughts on that part of this market, because it's also consumer tied. As you mentioned here, the basic goods. The catch is that a lot of these basic goods companies now, they're having a lot of trouble because you get all the basic goods on Amazon, et cetera.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, if you look at the earnings numbers that we saw this quarter, if you looked at the Coke, the Pepsi, the P&G, those big staples names that we're used to thinking about, they're actually all under a lot of pressure from smaller companies, mid-cap companies. Yeah. I think at this point, just as many people will go to Trader Joe's as they will to a Kroger's or something like that. So I think that part of the market is actually the most vulnerable to competition.